good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
This is a good-looking group here. I didn't know what to expect when I came back to Mullin. We drove downtown a while ago to look around, and I expected there to be a Walmart Supercenter down there and all that, but I think you've lost ground. There was Shelton's Grocery and the other grocery on the corner, and there was the Pentecostal church down there and the Shelton's Lumber Yard, and it's just all gone, isn't it? All gone. Still, yeah, we drove up to the school, and my son said, I wonder if they still have rodeos here. And I said, well, there's no grass growing out there, so I guess they do. By the way, my two boys started riding here, and later on, after we moved to North Texas, that bull riding cost Blue Cross $30,000, and this was back years ago. So, but we're glad to be back. I have my wife Lois with me, and Nathan, my oldest son, and Matt, my youngest son. We still have two daughters, Amy and Colleen. Amy did not go to school here, but the other three did. Matt went to Head Start. Ms. Collins used to pick them up and take them over to Goldthwaite to Head Start.
She's so sorry, I have to tell you, she's so sorry she couldn't be here today. They had a family reunion, and so they're down with the family. But she said, please tell him that I'm sorry I couldn't be here.
Okay. All right, thank you very much. But it is a joy to be here, to come back and share with you. And this mic, I guess, will quit going down there now. But we were here from November of 1969 to June of 72. And I remember it was a cold day when we moved into the parsonage, and we didn't have any heat. And Glenn Sanders got out and rustled up some heaters for us and saved the day. And so that was in 1969. And we left here in 72, and I have continued pastoring these years. In fact, my last pastorate was about 4 years ago. And when we get back next Sunday, I'm beginning an interim pastorate at a church there in Bonham. And I'm thankful that at 85, I'm still able to preach. Now, after I get through today, you might think, well, I don't know about being able to preach, but anyway, we're just glad to be here. I was in sort of a dilemma. I do not want to talk just about the building, and yet I don't want to drive 250 miles just to preach a sermon when your pastor could do that. So I've combined the two and tried to shorten them, and we'll have a little break between. And I want to talk with you, though, a little bit about this building that we're in. And first of all, I want to compliment you on the way you have kept it up. It just looks so nice. You've made some changes. The benches, I think, were red when we put them in. And the windows, we had fiberglass windows in it. I suppose they've been changed. And you added on to the fellowship hall, or to the educational part down on the end. That was not here when we built the building. But in 1969, and if you think I'm reading it, I'm going to kind of do that because I don't want to ramble too much. But in 1969, I was invited to come here and preach in view of a call. And another church in East Texas had invited me to come the same Sunday in view of a call. And the other church had a brand new building, and they were leveling the ground to build a new parsonage. And then we came to Mullin to look the situation over, and I hate to tell you this, but my wife cried all the way home. The old building was up on the highway. It was old, but I came to Mullin because I wanted to finish my degree at Howard Payne, and we were able to do that. But the old building was old and in pretty bad shape. The highway had taken much of the front of it, and when we closed out on Sunday night, we'd all go out onto the sidewalk between the highway and the church, and there was a rail there, and we'd lean against that rail and talk and visit for a while. So it was not a real good situation. The ladies of the Sunday school class had to station one of the ladies next to the window so on a windy day she could hold it to keep it from rattling in the frame. It was in such bad shape. Gas pipes had been laid across the floor, and one of them had a tendency to leak. At least one time we smelled gas and somebody had stepped on the pipe and it started leaking. Well, then in 1971, there came a hailstorm, and the roof of the old building was badly damaged. Well, we collected a little more than $900 from the insurance company, but we didn't know what we should do with it. If we replaced the roof, it would not help the building any, yet we knew we had to do something. And so the Building and Grounds Committee was made up of Glenn Sanders, Harold Locke, Ernest Lynn Fisher, and Earl Etheridge. And we met in the pastor's study to try to come up with a recommendation for what the church ought to do. And after some discussion, 3 of the men on that committee made a pledge and said they would give $1,000 toward a new building. One of the men said he would have to go to the bank and borrow it, but he would do it. The 4th man said he would give $500, and I know that that was a burden on these men to do that. But they were willing to do it, and they were willing to step out by faith. So we went to the church with a recommendation that we build a new building on the land that was behind the parsonage. Well, this land was vacant, and Earl Etheridge, well, the Locks gave my kids a pony. Earl Etheridge came here and worked building a fence around this lot here where we are now so that my kids could have a pony. Not long after that, we decided to build a new building, and poor Earl, he had to come back and take down the fence and move it over next door to the parsonage where your other building is now. But he did it. And we went to the church with a recommendation that we build a new building on this land. And in the meantime, a man here in the community who did not attend here, I don't know if he was a member anywhere, but his name was Dick Kemp. He sent a $1,000 check to the church. And when we voted to build this building, I had that $1,000 check in the pulpit, but we didn't tell the people that we had it. They voted to build a new building with no building funds. So it was by faith that this was done. Well, the problem developed into a vision. We didn't know how we would do it, but we had faith that somehow we could. So what do you do when you want to build a building? You go to the bank. And I'm not criticizing anyone. It's just, bank rules. I think his name was Warren Duran, was the president of the bank in Goldthwaite. And here's what he said. If y'all can raise half of the money, the bank will loan you the other half. And you know what? We never went back to the bank. Never went back. We had a few people here in the church who really weren't for building a new building. And it wasn't that they were negative or cantankerous or anything. They just didn't really feel like we could do it. But we voted to do it, and the people cooperated so well, and money began to come in. And it reminds me of William Carey, who was a missionary to Burma and to India, a pioneer missionary. And he went as a missionary when Baptists were not mission-minded. And he proposed to the Baptist Alliance that they send missionaries, or that they send him as a missionary. And an old preacher got up and said, "Young men, sit down. When God's ready to save the heathen, he'll do it without your help." Well, William Carey went on to India and Burma and did a great work for the Lord. And his motto was, expect great things from God and attempt great things for God. And I tell you, for the group that we had in 1971, that was a great thing to think about building a new building. When Nehemiah went back to Jerusalem from Babylonian captivity to rebuild the wall, there was opposition to that. But the majority of the people said to Nehemiah, let us rise up and build. Then they set their hands to this good work. And that was the Mullin Baptist Church. Let's rise up. We can do it. We can do it. And they set their hands to the work. So the people of this church in 1971 had a mind to work, just like those in Nehemiah's day. And as a result, this building stands as a monument today to their faith and determination that it could be done. Well, we met on a rainy Sunday afternoon for a groundbreaking. We pulled up out here under these trees, and since it was raining, most stayed in their cars, but some got out, and a picture was made for the paper, and in the picture was Glenn Sanders, Amy Sanders, my daughter Amy Rogers, and Ms. Baskin. I don't remember her first name, but Ms. Baskin. And we broke ground to build a new building. Well, after that, we began the foundation work. The women and children came. We got a bunch of plastic bags from Shelton's lumber yard. They were fertilizer bags. They'd been emptied. We got, I don't know how many hundred of them, but the women and the children filled those bags with sand, and we lined the trenches with those fertilizer bags. And so if this church ever blows up, it'll be because those fertilizer bags are under the foundation. And we hired 2 men to work, carpenters, but the rest was all volunteer labor. We had men in the church who were experienced in construction and more or less headed up the work of the building. The young people of the church got involved. They went out into the country and gathered up rocks. And you see the rocks out here on the bell tower and on the front of the church. That was the project of the young people of the church. Well, we had a few mishaps along the way. The forms gave way right over here in this corner when we were pouring the concrete, and I can still see the activity over there trying to brace them up and so on, and we got them braced up and went on and poured the concrete. We had hired an older carpenter work, and in all of his experience, he got his hand in the saw and cut his hand pretty badly. And then the utility company had buried the power lines coming to the building. They were buried back out there, and a man from the county was running a maintainer and smoothing the dirt for us, and he plowed up the utility lines. So we had a few mishaps like that, but they didn't stop us. Those who could work during the week did, and others came from their jobs when they could and worked. Others came on Saturday. It was a joint effort that our people joined in wholeheartedly to do, and God blessed it. I had a cheap folding white ruler, and they all teased me about it, my white ruler. They said things like that: if the building is crooked, it's the preacher's white ruler's fault. And it was all in fun. And they said they were going to put my white ruler in the cornerstone, so it may be in there. I don't know. I don't remember what happened to it, but it could be there. Incidentally, when we laid the cornerstone, do you know how we did it? I'm not going to tell you what's in it, and it was one of the men working. It was his idea. He went and got some 6-inch PVC pipe, and he put threaded couplings on each end. No, he didn't. We sealed it with a cap, I believe. And we put materials in that PVC pipe, which will last forever. And so inside the cornerstone, there is a PVC pipe about this long, and it has items in it, probably the membership roll, and maybe the Baptist Standard, and a few things like that. And so that's what happened there. As work continued, donations continued to come in. People who had grown up here in Mullin, who didn't live here anymore, heard about it and sent money. And you know, it was the happening of the community. Nothing had been built in Mullin for years. Tommy Shelton's service station's up here, the little cafe and those things downtown, but nothing new had been built here for years. But now this building was being built. Of course, the Church of Christ wasn't very old. It had been built here. But our people gave generously. We received a grant from the Oldham Little Church Foundation The Baptist General Convention of Texas building department furnished the furniture for the educational classrooms. We got from the Baptist General Convention the cutest little chairs for the children's classroom, and my daughter was about not quite 6 at the time, and she was so excited about those little chairs, and she was looking forward to being in Sunday school and getting to sit in those colorful little chairs. But you know what? The poor girl never did get to do it. We moved away before. So some of these days, if those little chairs are still back there, I might bring her back here and let her sit down in one of those little chairs. But we had a good time. There were those who gave sacrificially for their time and their money, but as we built, the needs were met. And the building was completed in May of 1972, and we planned a homecoming and a dedication. And I was thinking it was the first Sunday in June, but noticing the bulletin in the display case, apparently it was the last Sunday in May that we had the homecoming. And on that special day, we had the morning service in the old building, and then we went out after the service and opened the cornerstone. And in the cornerstone of this building, like I said, we placed some items which are still there. So I suppose you'll open that cornerstone when this building is 100 years old, but I don't think I'll be able to attend then. We then had lunch in the community center, followed by the afternoon service in the new building. And I want to say, and you can challenge me because it doesn't sound possible, but I want to say that we had over 400 people here that day. Now, I don't know where we put them, but they came from everywhere. They came from all around because Mullin had a new building, a brick building, and people came. And we had the afternoon service in the new building, which was dedicated for the glory of God. And we're probably saying, to God be the glory, but if we didn't, we should have, because God deserved all of the glory. Nehemiah said in chapter 12 of Nehemiah, "Now at the dedication of the wall of Jerusalem, they sought out the Levites in all their places to bring them to Jerusalem to celebrate the dedication with gladness, both with thanksgiving and singing, with cymbals and stringed instruments and harps. And the sons of the singers gathered together from the countryside around Jerusalem, from the villages of the Nephanites, from the house of Gilgal, and from the fields of Geba and Amaveth. Then the priests and Levites purified themselves and purified the people, the gates, and the wall. So Nehemiah said, So I brought up the leaders of Judah up on the wall and appointed 2 Lord's thanksgiving choirs. Also that day they offered great sacrifices and rejoiced, for God had made them rejoice with great joy. The women and children also rejoiced, so that the joy of Jerusalem was heard afar off. And the day we dedicated this building, the people truly rejoiced, because it was a miracle that we didn't have a building fund, we didn't have any money, but by the faith, people stepped out, and by faith, they gave. The total cost of the building that we built, and that's been added to, I understand that, but the building that we built, the total cost was $28,000. And when we had the dedication service, it was paid in full. We didn't owe a dime, because the people of Mullin Baptist Church came through. As the wall was rebuilt by Nehemiah and God's people, so this building was built here by God's people. It's truly a monument to what God can do through his people when they set their mind to it and dedicate themselves to the task. Now, I don't know if on that dedication day, I do not know if we sang "To God Be the Glory" or not, but if we didn't, we should have.
It was the first song played in this church. I was here that.
All right, good. Your memory is maybe better than mine. But I want us to stand and sing the first verse right now of "To God Be the Glory." You may be seated. Now, if I left out anyone, I maybe shouldn't have called names of different people, but if I left out anyone, the truth of the matter was everyone pitched in and worked. Even those who maybe were a little bit doubtful in the beginning, it was in one accord. And I didn't intend to leave anyone out when I mention these different names. Well, if you have your Bibles now, would you turn to the book of Galatians, chapter 6, and just one verse, verse 14. Galatians chapter 6 and verse 14. The Apostle Paul said to the church at Galatia in verse 14, "But God forbid that I should glory or boast except in the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ, by whom the world has been crucified to me, and I to the world." God forbid. The old King James Version says, "God forbid that I should glory," or the newer versions say that I should boast. But Paul said there are things that I could glory about if I wanted to. There are things I could boast about if I wanted to. But God forbid that I boast about anything except the cross of Jesus Christ. Because Paul, of course, he could have boasted about his heritage. The Bible says that he was a Hebrew of the Hebrews. He could boast about his citizenship because very few Jews enjoyed Roman citizenship, but Paul did. He could boast about his education. He had sat at the feet of Gamaliel, the great teacher, but he didn't boast about that. He could have boasted about his accomplishments. He made 3 missionary journeys that were great undertakings to carry the gospel to the heathen nations around him. He could have boasted about the books that he wrote. Now, we don't know for sure if he wrote 14, if he wrote 11, but even 11 is a great contribution. And Paul's books today, 2,000 years later, are still the bestseller of all time, the Bible. And he wrote part of it. So he could have gloried in all of those things, but he didn't. He said, "God forbid that I should glory in any of these things except the cross of Jesus Christ." When he looked at the cross, all of his accomplishments and everything else faded into oblivion compared to the cross. Why should he glory in the cross? Crucifixion in those days was the most horrible means of death that you could imagine. I read one time, one writer said that the victim of crucifixion literally died 1,000 deaths before he died. Nailed to a cross, suspended by the nails in his hands and his feet. If he relaxed his body, he couldn't breathe. So he had to hold himself up by those hands that were nailed and his feet that were nailed. Horrible way to die, but Jesus did. And Paul said that I will not glory in anything except the cross of Jesus Christ. The cross was reserved for the vilest of criminals. And when Jesus died, he was between 2 thieves. It was a thing that the Romans said, be it far from any Roman citizen to go through crucifixion. It was reserved for the vilest of sinners, and yet Jesus did that, the cross. And you know, the cross has become probably the most universal symbol of any kind in all the world. Everywhere you go, you see crosses. In the county where we live, the county building was outgrown, and a church had outgrown its building and built a new building. So the county bought the church and converted it into county offices. And in the front of that building, in the brick is light tan, but in darker brown, there is in that brick wall a cross. Everywhere you go, the cross. And you know, you see people who probably are not even Christians, but they'll be wearing a cross because the cross is a symbol of what Jesus did for us. And Paul said, God forbid that I should glory in anything except the cross of Jesus Christ. Why would he glory in the cross? First of all, it's the evidence of God's love. The evidence of God's love. John 3:16 was fulfilled on the cross. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. That verse was literally fulfilled on the cross. The songwriter said it was his love for me that nailed him to the tree to die in agony for all my sin. For my own guilt and shame, the great Redeemer came, willing to bear the shame for all my sin. And so he who knew no sin became sin for us, that we might be saved. Over in Romans chapter 5, I believe it's verse 6 and 8. Romans chapter 5 and verse 6, for when we were still without strength, in due time Christ died for the ungodly. For scarcely for a righteous man will one die, yet peradventure for a good man someone would even dare to die. But God demonstrates his love toward us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. And folks, I contend that the greatest 4 words ever written were those last 4 words. Christ died for us. How could God die? Jesus was not only the Son of God, he was God in the flesh. He was God himself, the Son, God the Son. How could God die? And secondly, why would God die? But he did because he loved us. It was his love for us that nailed him to a tree. And so the cross is the evidence of God's love. And if someone says, I just don't think that God loves me, just point them to the cross and say, there's proof that God does love those who are sinners. And secondly, the cross is the basis for forgiveness. God is bound by his righteousness. Because man's sin, God cannot, even though he's God, he's a righteous God, and his law must be carried out. And so God could not simply overlook our sin. Sin had to be paid for. And Jesus died for our sin. And it became the basis upon which God could forgive us. Just think about it. God looked down on that awful scene. His son bleeding and dying and suffering. And when he said, it is finished, then God could say, I can forgive all those who come to me through my Son, Jesus Christ. Peter said in 1 Peter chapter 1, for as much as you know that you were not redeemed with corruptible things as silver and gold from your vain conversation received by tradition from your fathers, but you were redeemed with the precious blood of Christ as of a lamb without blemish and without spot. There's an old poem written by Rose Thorpe in 1867 called Curfew Must Not Ring Tonight. Has anybody ever read it? Curfew Must Not Ring Tonight. Look it up and read it sometime. But in this poem, Basil Underwood was condemned to die. He was in a prison waiting to be hanged, and he had a sweetheart. And she went to the prison to beg. In the poem, she went to the prison to beg for his release. And of course, she was turned down. And Cromwell was the ruler, but he was not available. And she headed toward the bell tower because her sweetheart was scheduled to be hanged when curfew rang that evening. And she headed toward the bell tower. And the old sexton was just beginning to move toward the bell tower. Very slowly he moved. But he went in there where the rope was hanging. And she knew that when he pulled on that rope, and that bell began to ring, that her lover would be hanged. And so she said, curfew must not ring tonight. And she went up the stairs. The old stairs were musty and old and spider webs everywhere. But she went up the stairs where that great bell was hanging. And in the poem, and incidentally, Rose Thorpe was only 16 when she wrote this poem. Read it sometime. The great bell was beginning to swing. And she knew that when that clapper hit the side of the bell, that her sweetheart would be hanged. And so she leaped, or leapt, whichever you prefer, out and grabbed the clapper in her hands. And that bell, when it swung out, her hands were around the clapper so that the sound was muffled. And when it swung the other way, her hands were still there. And it swung back and forth. And the poet says that it swung her way out over the land. And back, out, over the land, back and forth. But finally, the old sexton stopped, and the bell was still, and she dropped off. And she looked, and she saw Cromwell coming. And she ran down the stairs, ran to his feet, or ran to him and fell at his feet and pleaded her case. And she held out her hands, and they were bleeding. They were bruised. And she said, my lover was to be hanged, but I want him to be free. And Cromwell looked at those hands, and when he saw her bruised, bloody hands, he said, go your way. Your sweetheart will live. And folks, I took time to tell that because to me it is such an illustration of what Jesus did for us. He climbed up on Calvary's mountain. He stretched out his arms, and they nailed his hands to the cross. They nailed his feet to the cross. And when Jesus went back to heaven, incidentally, what did Jesus take back to heaven that he didn't bring from heaven? Think about it. The scars in his hand. And I like to think that when he went back to heaven and the angels saw him, the cry went out, the Son has returned. And when the angels all gathered around in my imagination to welcome him home, I think they began to whisper, look at his hands, look at his feet. They're all bruised. They're broken looking. But when God saw the travail of his soul, the Bible says, and he was satisfied. When God saw those bruised, broken hands of his dear Son, he said, now I can forgive man of his sins. And I think that curfew must not ring tonight clearly illustrates that. And then thirdly, Paul gloried in the cross because it's the way home. Paul had tried many ways to find his way to God. He became a Pharisee, which was no small accomplishment. He wrote, no doubt, things even before he wrote the Bible because he was an educated man. He had tried many things to find his way home to God. But like the prodigal son, he was lost. He was a persecutor of the church. He did everything he could to destroy the church and stamp it out. And I think that somehow he knew that this was the way, the right way. And finally on the Damascus Road, he yielded to God and he found his way home. The cross is the only way home. That old song that we used to sing, I must needs go home by the way of the cross. There's no other way but this. I will ne'er get sight of the gates of light if the way of the cross I miss. The way of the cross leads home. The way of the cross leads home. It is sweet to know as I onward go that the way of the cross leads home. I want to close with a story. Now, I was told one time you shouldn't tell anything in the pulpit unless you know for sure that it actually happened. But I'm going to tell this one anyway because I heard it at the State Evangelism Conference, and I'm sure the preacher that told it would not have told it if it was not true. But it's a good story anyway, and I'm going to share it with you. A family moved from a rural area to a great city, and they went out for a walk on Saturday. And they walked not far from their house, and they saw a church. And they looked up, and on top of the steeple there was a cross. And the father said, here's a church with a cross. Said, they must preach Jesus here since there's a cross. Well, he said, we'll come to church here tomorrow. And they did. The next week, the little boy and the family went out to explore like boys do. And he walked down the street a ways and walked down another street and just fascinated by the city, just going on. And before long, he realized that he was lost. He had no idea where he was. And so he began to cry. And a policeman came along, picked him up and took him to the station. And they began to talk to him. And they said, son, where do you live? And he said, I don't know. And they said, son, is there a school close to where you live? And he said, I don't know. They said, well, is there a store? He said, I don't know. I don't know where I live. I don't know what's close by. And they said, is there anything close to your house that you can tell us about? And the little boy remembered the church with the cross on top. And he said to the police, sir, if you'll take me to the cross, I can find my way home. What a story. Too good not to tell. If it didn't happen, it should have. But if you'll lead me to the cross, I can find my way home. How can you come home to God today if you're not a Christian? By coming to the cross. Only the cross of Jesus Christ, where he shed his precious blood, is sufficient to save a soul like you and like me. I don't know if you have an invitation hymn here or not, but we're going to do that, and I'm going to ask the pastor to come and take over the service. I've enjoyed being here so much today. For several years, I've been counting the days, literally. I'm 85 years old, and when I was about 82 or 83, I thought, Mullin Church would be 50 years old pretty soon. I hope I can go back. And then as it got closer, I began to think about it more and more. And then I kind of forgot about it. And my son Nathan, not long ago, just a couple of weeks ago, he said, Dad, are we going to go to Mullin? I said, oh, yeah. It's just right here upon us, isn't it? And so I'm so thankful that we got to come back today and see this building and see you and share with you the things that we've been able to share. God bless you, Pastor, for letting me do this. Thank you for being here today. So I'll turn the service over to you.
Thank you.